Hi, and welcome to English Inside Out.
The podcast where you learn English from the inside out.
We're Alex,
And Emma,
and in just a few minutes a day,
you'll improve your English, your mindset, and your confidence.
let's get started. You know, Emma, there's a sentence I hear almost as often as, I can't speak English. And that sentence is, I'm afraid of my accent. People say it with a mix of embarrassment and frustration, like their accent is something they need to hide or apologize for. And very often, this fear is strong enough to stop them from speaking at all. What's interesting is that most of the time, these people are actually understandable. They can communicate, but in their own minds, their accent feels like a big problem. Bigger than grammar, bigger than vocabulary, bigger than confidence. And because of that, they start every conversation already tense. They think about how they sound instead of what they want to say. And that changes everything.
Yes, and this fear usually doesn't come from nowhere. People don't wake up one day and suddenly hate their accent. It's built over time, through comparisons, comments, corrections, and unrealistic expectations. Many learners believe that speaking English well means sounding like a native speaker. And if they don't sound like one, they feel like they're doing something wrong. So instead of focusing on communication, they focus on their accent. Every sound, every word, every mistake. I've met people who understand conversations perfectly, but avoid speaking because they don't like the way their English sounds. They feel exposed when they speak, like their accent reveals something about them they don't want others to see.
And that's the sad part. Your accent becomes something emotional, not linguistic. It's no longer just about pronunciation. It's about identity, about confidence, about belonging. I've seen learners start sentences with apologies. Sorry for my English, or my accent is bad, but... And that apology already puts them in a weak position. They're judging themselves before anyone else does. The irony is that most listeners are not focusing on the accent at all. They're focusing on the message. But when you're insecure, you imagine that everyone is listening only to how you sound.
And this fear creates silence. People choose not to speak because silence feels safer than being judged. But silence doesn't protect your English. It freezes it. So in this episode, we want to say something very clearly from the beginning. Your accent is not the problem. And before we talk about techniques or practice, we need to talk about this belief. Because as long as you believe your accent is the main issue, it will continue to block your progress. People blame their accent because it's the most obvious difference they hear when they speak English. Grammar mistakes can be hidden. Lack of vocabulary can be worked around. But your accent? You hear it immediately. And because you hear it so clearly, you assume everyone else does too. From a very early stage, learners are taught, directly or indirectly, that good English sounds a certain way, usually American or British. And everything that doesn't match that sound is treated as a problem to fix. Over time, this idea becomes internalized. People start measuring their English against an unrealistic standard. Another reason people blame their accent is comparison. They hear someone who sounds fluent, smooth, and confident, and they assume the accent is the reason. They don't see the years of exposure, practice, and mistakes behind that voice. They only hear the result.
Yes, and there's also the influence of correction. Many people were corrected constantly when they tried to speak. Sometimes kindly, sometimes not. And even small comments like, "That's not how you pronounce it," can stay in someone's mind for years. Those experiences teach learners to associate speaking with judgment. So instead of enjoying communication, they start monitoring themselves. Every sound becomes a risk. Every sentence becomes a test. Another thing is that accent becomes an easy explanation. It's simple to say, I don't speak well because of my accent. It feels clearer than dealing with more complex issues like confidence, rhythm, or fear of making mistakes. Accent becomes a symbol for all those hidden problems.
And we can't ignore the role of media and social networks. People constantly hear perfect English online, edited videos, trained speakers, influencers who practice pronunciation for hours. That creates unrealistic expectations. Learners forget that real English in the real world is full of different accents, strong accents, soft accents, accents that mix languages, and most of the time, communication still works. So when someone says, "My accent is the problem," what they often mean is, I don't feel confident speaking. And that's a very different issue.
Exactly. And understanding this difference is the first step to moving forward. Because once you stop blaming your accent, you can finally focus on what actually helps your English improve. Exactly. And understanding this difference is the first step to moving forward. Because once you stop blaming your accent, you can finally focus on what actually helps your English improve. Communication is about being understood. Accent is just the way your English sounds. You can have a strong accent and still communicate perfectly. And you can also have a good accent and still struggle to express ideas. In real life, people understand each other all the time with different accents. At work, at airports, in meetings, online. English today is a global language. Most conversations in English happen between non-native speakers. And accents are everywhere.
Yes. And when communication breaks down, it's usually not because of accent. It's because of other things. Speaking too fast, speaking too quietly, not finishing sentences, or being too afraid to continue when something goes wrong. Many learners focus so much on sounding right that they forget to speak clearly. They lower their voice, they hesitate, they swallow words, and that affects understanding much more than accent ever will. Clarity comes from structure, from pauses, from emphasis. It comes from confidence, not from sounding like someone else.
Another important point is that listeners are used to accents, especially in English. They don't expect everyone to sound the same. What they need is a clear message. Think about your own experience. How many times have you understood someone with an accent in your language? Probably many times. You focus on what they're saying, not on how they sound. The same thing happens in English. Most people are listening for meaning, not perfection.
So when learners say, "They didn't understand me because of my accent," very often the real issue was something else. Maybe the sentence was too long. Maybe the idea wasn't clear. Maybe the speaker stopped too many times. Accent becomes the scapegoat. But when you separate accent from communication, you gain freedom. You stop fighting your voice and start using it.
And that shift changes everything. Because once communication becomes the priority, fluency improves naturally.
One of the most important things learners need to hear is this: everyone has an accent. There is no such thing as no accent. What people usually mean by no accent is an accent I'm used to hearing. Native speakers have accents too. American English has many accents. British English has many accents, and they sound very different from each other. But learners are rarely taught that. They're usually shown only one correct model. When you realize this, something changes. You stop seeing your accent as a mistake and start seeing it as a variation. Just one more way English exists in the world.
And in real life, English is not owned by one country or one accent. It's spoken globally, by millions of people with different linguistic backgrounds. Accents are part of that reality. Think about international companies, universities, or conferences. You hear Indian accents, European accents, Asian accents, African accents, all communicating effectively in English. And no one stops the conversation to say, "Wait, your accent is wrong." People adjust. They listen. Communication continues.
When learners understand that accents are normal, the pressure to fix their accent starts to fade. And that pressure is what blocks fluency. Your accent tells a story. It shows that you learned another language. That's not a weakness. That's an achievement.
Exactly. And the more you accept that, the easier it becomes to speak freely. This is where accent stops being just a pronunciation issue and becomes something much bigger. A mental block. When people are constantly worried about their accent, they stop focusing on communication and start monitoring themselves all the time. Every sentence becomes stressful. Before speaking, they think, "How will this sound?" While speaking, they think, "Did I pronounce that correctly?" And after speaking, they replay the conversation in their head. That constant self-monitoring is exhausting, and it kills fluency. Instead of speaking naturally, learners speak carefully, slowly, hesitantly. And ironically, that makes them harder to understand, not easier.
Yes, and once accent becomes a mental block, people start censoring themselves. They speak less. They choose simpler ideas, not because they can't express more, but because they don't want to risk sounding wrong. Some people stop telling stories, others stop making jokes, others avoid expressing opinions, not because they don't have them, but because they don't trust their voice. This self-censorship slowly disconnects the learner from their personality in English. They feel like a smaller version of themselves, and that's very frustrating.
Another thing that happens is anticipation. People expect problems before they even start speaking. They assume they won't be understood, and that expectation changes their body language. Lower voice, less eye contact, shorter answers. Listeners pick up on that. Not the accent, but the insecurity. And once insecurity enters the conversation, everything feels harder.
The important thing to understand is that the accent itself didn't create the block. The belief about the accent did. When learners change that belief, when they stop seeing their accent as a problem, the block slowly disappears. Fluency grows not because the accent changed, but because confidence did. One of the biggest mistakes learners make is blaming their accent for problems that actually come from other areas. Accent is easy to blame because it's audible, but most communication issues are not caused by pronunciation alone. For example, rhythm is a huge factor. English has a specific rhythm. Some words are stressed, others are reduced. When learners speak with flat rhythm, even correct pronunciation can sound unclear. But instead of noticing rhythm, they say, "My accent is bad." Another common issue is intonation. When your voice goes up and down naturally, listeners understand meaning more easily. Questions, emphasis, emotion. All of that lives in intonation. Without it, speech sounds robotic or uncertain. Again, learners think it's accent, but it's not.
Yes, and pauses are another big one. Many learners pause in the middle of sentences too often, especially because they're translating or overthinking. Those pauses break the message and confuse listeners. When that happens, people often say, "They didn't understand me because of my accent." But what really happened was that the message didn't flow. Another thing people confuse with accent is lack of confidence. Speaking quietly, avoiding eye contact, or rushing words makes communication harder. Confidence affects clarity more than pronunciation ever will.
There's also the issue of word stress. English listeners rely heavily on stressed syllables to understand meaning. If stress is missing or inconsistent, comprehension drops. But again, learners blame accent instead of noticing this specific skill. The good news is that all these things, rhythm, intonation, stress, confidence, improve naturally when you speak more and stop obsessing over sounding perfect.
So when someone says, "My accent is the problem," it's worth asking, is it really? Or is it something else that can be improved with practice and awareness? Once you identify the real issue, progress becomes much easier. At some point, learners need to make a decision, maybe without even realizing it. Do you want to sound native, or do you want to be understood? Because these two goals are not the same, and chasing the first one often hurts the second. Clarity is what keeps conversations moving. It's what allows ideas to be exchanged. And clarity comes from being organized, using familiar structures, and speaking with intention. None of that requires a native accent. In fact, many people who try too hard to sound native end up overthinking their pronunciation. They slow down unnaturally, exaggerate sounds, or hesitate. And that makes them less clear.
Yes, and listeners don't need perfection. They need signals, clear stress, clear pauses, clear keywords. When those things are present, understanding happens, even with a strong accent. Think about people you've understood easily even though they had an accent. What helped you understand them? Probably the way they structured their sentences and emphasized important words. That's why focusing on clarity is liberating. It gives you permission to speak as you are, instead of trying to become someone else.
And when clarity becomes the goal, confidence grows. You stop apologizing. You stop explaining yourself before speaking. You just speak. And that change is often more noticeable to listeners than any pronunciation improvement.
Trying to lose your accent sounds like a positive goal, but for many learners, it becomes a trap. When the main focus is getting rid of an accent, speaking turns into constant self-correction. Every word becomes something to monitor, and that level of control is exhausting. Instead of expressing ideas, learners start performing. They repeat words silently before saying them. They stop mid-sentence to fix a sound. They restart phrases because they didn't like how they sounded. And all of that breaks fluency. The problem is not pronunciation practice itself. That can be very useful. The problem is obsession. When accent becomes the priority, communication moves to second place.
Yes, and another issue is that the goal is often unrealistic. Accents are deeply connected to how you learned sounds early in life. That doesn't mean you can't improve pronunciation, but expecting to erase your accent completely creates constant frustration. Many learners feel like they're never good enough, no matter how much they improve. And that feeling makes them avoid speaking, because speaking becomes a reminder of what they think is wrong. Ironically, this pressure often slows down natural pronunciation improvement. When you speak less, you get less exposure, less repetition, and less confidence. So the accent stays, not because it can't change, but because speaking stopped.
Another thing people don't realize is that accent usually improves naturally when fluency improves. As you speak more, your rhythm becomes more natural. Your stress patterns improve. Your pronunciation gets clearer, without forcing it. But when learners are obsessed with accent, they interrupt this natural process. They're always pulling the brakes instead of letting the language flow. That's why focusing on communication first is so important. When communication works, pronunciation follows.
So if your main goal is to lose your accent, it might be time to change that goal. A better goal is to be understood easily and to feel comfortable speaking. When you release the pressure to sound native, English often becomes lighter, faster, and more enjoyable. Building confidence with your own voice is one of the most overlooked parts of learning English. People focus so much on how they should sound that they forget something basic. Confidence comes from familiarity. If your English voice still feels strange to you, it's very hard to feel confident using it. For many learners, hearing themselves speak English feels uncomfortable. It sounds different from their native language voice, and that difference creates insecurity. They think, "This doesn't sound like me." And because of that, they disconnect emotionally from the language. But the truth is, everyone has a different voice in another language. Your tone, your rhythm, even your personality sound a little different. That doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's new. Confidence starts when you stop reacting emotionally every time you hear yourself speak. And the only way to reach that point is exposure, repetition, getting used to your own English voice.
Yes, and one important thing learners need to understand is that confidence is not about liking your accent. It's about accepting it. You don't need to love how you sound in English. You just need to stop fighting it. A lot of people waste energy trying to hide their accent. They speak less. They lower their voice. They rush words. They avoid certain sounds. And all of that actually makes communication harder. When you accept your voice, you speak more freely. Your breathing becomes calmer. Your rhythm improves naturally. And even if the accent doesn't change much, clarity improves a lot. Another key part of confidence is ownership. Speaking without apologizing. Without saying, "Sorry, my English is bad," or "Sorry for my accent." Those apologies send a message, not to the listener, but to yourself. They reinforce the idea that something is wrong.
And confidence also grows when you separate identity from performance. Making a pronunciation mistake doesn't mean you failed. It just means a sound didn't come out the way you wanted. That's a technical detail, not a personal problem. Learners who build confidence understand this difference. They don't take mistakes personally. They keep speaking. And because they keep speaking, they improve. Another powerful way to build confidence is hearing yourself succeed. Not perfectly, but successfully. When someone understands you, when a conversation continues, when you finish an idea, those moments matter. They teach your brain that your English works. And once your brain believes that your English works, fear starts to fade.
Confidence is also connected to consistency. If you only speak English once in a while, every conversation feels like a big event. But when you speak regularly, even alone, English stops feeling special. It becomes familiar. And familiarity reduces anxiety. That's why people who talk to themselves, record voice notes, or practice regularly alone often sound more confident in conversations. Not because their accent disappeared, but because they trust their voice. And here's an important reminder. Confident speakers are not people who never feel nervous. They are people who speak despite the nervousness. They don't wait for confidence to appear. They create it through action.
So, if you're struggling with confidence and your accent, don't ask yourself, how can I sound better? Ask yourself, how can I get more comfortable hearing my own English voice? Because when comfort grows, confidence follows. And when confidence grows, your accent stops being a problem and starts being just part of who you are as a speaker.
Improving pronunciation is not the same as trying to erase your accent, and this difference is very important. Pronunciation work should support communication, not control it. When done the right way, it helps you feel clearer and more confident, not more tense. One of the most practical things learners can do is focus on key sounds, not every sound. English has some sounds that really affect understanding. When those sounds are clear enough, communication works, even if everything else isn't perfect. Another helpful focus is word stress. Knowing which part of a word is stressed makes your speech much easier to understand. You don't need to pronounce every sound perfectly if the stress is clear.
Yes, and rhythm is another powerful area to work on. English is not spoken word by word. It has a flow. Some words are strong, others are reduced. When learners practice rhythm, their speech becomes more natural very quickly. Shadowing is great for this. Listening and repeating real English helps your mouth learn timing and melody without thinking about rules. You're training your ear and your body at the same time. Another practical tip is choosing pronunciation practice with limits. For example, focusing on one sound for a few days instead of trying to fix everything. That keeps practice light and realistic.
And it's important to connect pronunciation practice to real speech. Practicing sounds in isolation is fine, but they need to appear in sentences. Otherwise, they don't transfer to conversations. Also, pronunciation improves best when you're relaxed. Tension makes sounds harder. So if practice is making you anxious, it's not helping.
The goal of pronunciation practice is not to sound native. It's to sound clear and confident. And when pronunciation supports communication instead of competing with it, improvement happens naturally. One of the biggest fears learners have about their accent is how other people will react. They imagine negative reactions, confusion, impatience, judgment, even laughter. And because of that imagination, they hold back. But here's the reality. Most people react very differently than learners expect. In real conversations, most listeners are focused on their own goals. They want information. They want to solve a problem. They want to connect. They are not analyzing your pronunciation. They're listening for meaning. When someone has an accent, the most common reaction is simple adjustment. People listen a little more carefully. They ask a question if they don't understand. And then the conversation continues.
Yes, and it's important to say this clearly. Having an accent is normal, especially in English. Most people who use English daily are used to hearing accents. Strong ones, soft ones, mixed ones. Confusion doesn't automatically mean rejection. Sometimes people ask you to repeat not because your accent is bad, but because the environment is noisy, or they didn't expect that sentence, or they just missed a word. Learners often take those moments personally. They think, my accent is terrible. But listeners are usually not making that judgment at all.
Another thing people worry about is being judged intellectually. They fear that their accent makes them sound less intelligent or less professional. But in reality, clarity and confidence matter much more. When someone speaks calmly, clearly, and with confidence, listeners respect them, regardless of accent. On the other hand, someone who sounds insecure and apologetic may be judged negatively, even with good pronunciation. People respond to energy more than sound.
And let's be honest, if someone does judge you because of your accent, that says more about them than about you. That's not a language problem. That's a human problem. Most positive interactions happen when learners stop assuming the worst and allow the conversation to flow naturally. When you speak without fear, people respond to that openness.
So, if you're worried about how people react to your accent, remember this. Most people are on your side. They want communication to work. And when you give yourself permission to speak, others usually do too.
One of the most surprising things for learners is discovering when accent actually improves. And it's usually not when they're trying to fix it. Accent tends to improve naturally when other things come first: fluency, confidence, and exposure. When you speak more, your mouth becomes more comfortable with English sounds. Your rhythm adjusts. Your intonation becomes more natural. Not because you forced it, but because your body adapted. Language lives in the body, not just in the mind. This is why people often say, "I don't know when it happened, but my pronunciation got better." It wasn't a single technique. It was time, repetition, and comfort.
Yes, and another big factor is listening. When you listen to English regularly, podcasts, videos, conversations, your brain slowly builds a sound map. And when you speak, your mouth tries to match that map. But this only works when you're relaxed. If you're tense, your speech muscles tighten, and pronunciation suffers. That's why focusing too much on accent can actually slow improvement. Accent improves when English stops feeling foreign, when it becomes familiar, when it becomes part of your daily life.
Another moment when accent improves naturally is when learners stop translating. Translation creates pauses and tension. When you think directly in English, your speech becomes smoother and sounds connect more easily. And again, this doesn't happen overnight. It's gradual, but it's reliable.
So if you want your accent to improve, paradoxically, the best thing you can do is stop obsessing over it. Focus on communication, focus on speaking more. Accent will follow. If there's one message we want you to take from this episode, it's this. Your accent is not a mistake. It's part of your story. It shows that you learned another language, that you stepped outside your comfort zone, that you communicate beyond your first language. An accent is not something you need to erase before you're allowed to speak. It's not a problem you need to solve. It's just one part of how your English sounds. And it doesn't define how good your English is. When you stop apologizing for your accent, something changes. You stand taller. You speak more freely. And people respond to that confidence.
Yes, and remember, English is a global language. It doesn't belong to one country, one accent, or one way of speaking. Your voice belongs in English exactly as it is. You don't need to sound like someone else to be respected. You don't need to hide your accent to be understood. What matters is your message, your presence, and your willingness to communicate. So the next time you hesitate because of your accent, remember this conversation. Remember that fluency grows when you allow yourself to speak, not when you wait to sound perfect.
Speak clearly. Speak confidently. Speak without asking permission.
Because your accent is not the problem.
And before we finish, we want to hear from you. Because this conversation doesn't end here, it continues with your story.
Tell us in the comments. Have you ever felt ashamed of your accent? Have you ever stayed quiet because you were afraid of how your English sounded?
Sharing your experience can help other learners realize they're not alone, and that their accent is part of their journey too.
If this episode spoke to you, leave a comment, like the video, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today.
Thank you for listening.
And remember, your voice deserves space.
See you in the next episode.